Hidden Fear, a Hazel Levesque and Nico di Angelo Halloween fanfiction. The Tyrant's Tomb, spoilers ahead. As Hazel watched the last of the countryside pass, she tried to shake off her motion sickness. Whether it was on the Argo II sailing over Europe or in one of Camp Jupiter's vans driving across the US, her head just didn't feel at ease in a moving environment. The Argo II. She closed her eyes and tried to reconjure those memories. After the war with the Giants, when Raina had announced that Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter would be working together on both crises and parties, Hazel thought it was a joke. Yet here she was, on the way to the Greek camp, alongside the other demigods who had opted to join the Halloween festivities. Next year they'd be celebrating at Camp Jupiter, but for now, she enjoyed the break from being Priador. It almost reminded her of the good old days. As difficult as her time aboard that ship had been, nothing she experienced at Camp Jupiter would ever feel quite as special. She would never be as close to anyone else as she was with the other members of the Seven. They were her family. Though she saw Frank every day and had been seeing Percy and Annabeth occasionally since their college semester had started at New Rome, nothing would be quite the same as seeing everyone back together again. Well, almost everyone. She didn't want to think about having to bury her own friend earlier that year, or how much she wished she could believe it wouldn't leave a permanent mark on the group's bond. She turned away those memories. No reason to let grief get the better of her on a day like today. She thought about Leo and his girlfriend Calypso. She'd seen him a few times after the Giant War, but they'd never really gotten a chance to talk. She wanted to hear about everything that had happened to him since then. She had hardly seen Piper at all. Where had life taken her? And of course, there was her brother Nico. They had had a few chats through Iris message over the last year, but he was never super keen on sharing all the little details of his life. She knew it just didn't come naturally to him, but she wanted to know everything. The van hit a bump in the road. Pluto's pauldrons, did it have to be so nauseating? The last time she'd felt this sick, a snow goddess had been about to attack the Argo too. She remembered the crew's discomfort as they theorized about Diocletian's scepter being the cause of the storm. When her seasickness had gotten the better of her and she'd had to go below deck, Nico, who had been especially distant since finding the scepter, had kissed her on the cheek before leaving the group in what almost felt like a goodbye. She hadn't known it at the time, but he was saying goodbye. He had been planning to leave both camps after the war. They had both been through so much since then, including finding people who loved them, who they belonged with. Even if those people had been right in front of them for a while. They were children of the underworld from the 1940s with years of trauma yet unpacked. In addition to sounding like the start of a bar joke, it was clear that they shouldn't have been able to find happiness. And yet, they had. Hazel tried to think about that when it was a bad day or a nightmare-ridden night. We're both still here. And loved. That has to count for something. And it means I'm not alone. Frank squeezed her hand. You okay? She nodded. Just queasy. Are we there yet? Another hour or so to go, he said gently. Hazel leaned back in her seat. Great. When she saw the first trees decked out with spider webs, rubber bats, and hanging skeletons, her unease was replaced with nervous excitement. She glanced at Frank. Despite his torn shirt and pants, with a sickly green-painted face and stitches, he still looked like a huge teddy bear. In the best possible way. How do I look? She asked him, pulling her hair back to reveal her latest work of art. Exaggerated dark bangs under her eyes and jagged teeth all around her mouth like a crooked smile. Beautiful, he said, dazed. He blinked. Terrifying. Ugly like a real murderer. Not that you're... She stopped him with a kiss. Frank didn't always know the right thing to say, but he was trying. Even after all their life and death situations changing him growing so much more confident in who he was and what he could do, there would always be a little hint of awkward clumsiness left in him. And she loved that about him. We're here, said Percy's voice from the front of the van. Cheers erupted all around them. More importantly, Annabeth's voice added, Percy got us here without crashing into the ocean. The cheers got even louder before bursting right into laughter. Percy groaned. Your mother will be proud, seaweed brain. As kids filed out of the van, they were greeted by a nymph dressed in black with a pointy hat. Someone from the crowd called out, Look, Hazel, someone stole your costume. Hazel felt the awful wave of whispers and claps before she even heard it. But before she could think of something to say, Lavinia yelled back, You mean like how a first grader stole your sense of humor? The demigods immediately went, Oh! Hazel tried to spot Lavinia, but by the time she did, Lavinia was already chatting with her friends like nothing had happened. Frank put an arm around her. She sighed. She knew some of the kids at Camp Jupiter thought that a witch costume would be perfect for her, either as some cruel joke or some careless small-talk suggestion that somehow hurt just as much. They knew her mother's history with, well, that. She didn't know for the life of her how they found out, but much like Octavian's old rumors about her coming back from the dead, they had a way of spreading and lingering. Of course, this was nothing new. It had been this way since Nico had brought her to camp. Frank pulled her close and kissed her. Percy spotted them in the crowd and headed towards them, putting a hand on Hazel's arm. Hazel let the warmth of the gestures wash over her and had just enough time to say thank you and start to feel embarrassed when the Dryad called out, "Welcome, Roman demigods!" She gestured around her. "As you can see, the forests around Camp Half-Blood are haunted on All Hallows' Eve. The only way into camp is through this pathway." It was pretty clear she wasn't serious, but Hazel welcomed the opportunity to make believe as they made their way through the forest, as did those around her. One would think that knowing monsters, magic, and wrathful gods were real would make celebrating something like Halloween hard, but it felt good to get spooked for once without her life being in imminent danger. To be able to do normal teen things when she was scared, like grabbing her boyfriend's arm or laughing with her friends about it. Percy adjusted the belt on his pirate costume. "They really pulled out all the stops. Some things never change about this old place, huh?" "It's cheesy," Annabeth said, leaning against him in her matching costume. "I love it." Back in New Rome, Percy wouldn't stop bragging about how he had totally won the argument over what they were going to wear for Halloween by convincing Annabeth to dress as a pirate with him instead of a mad scientist, but Hazel doubted she had put up that much of a fight. "I guess the whole haunted forest thing makes sense," Frank said, "since we're literally in a forest. Still, they could have gotten much more creative." He smiled. "We are totally going to leave them in the dust next year with our party." Hazel laughed and put a hand on his chest. "Sure, Frank." After a few jump scares, a decent-looking haunted forest, and enough spiders to give Annabeth several heart attacks, the group finally arrived at the dining pavilion. Hazel had hardly realized how hungry she was, but they'd been traveling all night. Her stomach growled. As she looked around for Nico, she noticed that the Hades table was empty. No surprise there. Nico really wasn't a morning person. With all the camp's visitors, Chiron and Mr. D decided to forego the conventional rules of sitting with your siblings, so Hazel, Frank, Percy, and Annabeth all sat together as Percy regaled the gang with tales of Halloween's past from New York. "You should have seen how many inflatables this dude had on his front lawn," he was saying as Hazel had almost finished her crepes. "Grover almost grabbed one and ran off with it." Hazel's thoughts trailed off as she scanned the tables, until her eyes rested on a familiar face. "Leo!" she called out, and before she knew it, she was running towards him. Leo stood up and caught her in a hug. "Hazel," he said warmly. "Aw, man, it's good to see you." Frank walked over and clapped Leo on the shoulder. "Hey, man." Leo grinned. "What do you think of my costume?" He gestured to his white dress and tutu. He wore a pair of feathered wings behind him and a plastic white ring around his forehead that was probably supposed to be a halo. "An angel," Hazel laughed. "Suits you." "I know, right?" he agreed. "Oh, yeah," Frank said sarcastically. "When I hear Leo's name, the first thing I think of is angelic." Hysterical. An auburn-haired girl walked up next to Leo with a red shirt and pants. She wore red sequined cat ears and a belt that turned into an arrow-shaped tail. "Oh, babe, you've never met these guys," Leo said suddenly. "Calypso, this is Hazel and that's Frank, from Camp Jupiter. Hazel and Frank, this is my girlfriend, Calypso." "You did a couple's costume," Frank remarked. "I don't see the appeal of it, honestly," Calypso admitted. "This one just goes around laughing while introducing our costumes to people." She shrugged. "He seems to find it hilarious that I'm the devil instead of him." "Oh, come on," Leo said. "It's ironic, isn't it?" "It was your idea." "Exactly." Hazel laughed, more genuinely than she had in a long time. She spent the rest of the morning with Leo, catching up. Even after she'd stopped having feelings for him, they'd always had this uncanny ability to just talk for hours without running out of things to say. And today was no different, even with Calypso joining the conversation. Her relationship with Leo may not have been a perfect fairy tale romance, but it was obvious how much they liked each other. Hazel knew they would find a way. That was what Leo did best. After lunch, she went searching for Nico, only to encounter the single strangest Halloween costume she had ever seen. "It's a minion," Piper said. "A minion?" "Yeah, like from Despicable Me." Hazel stared blankly at her. Piper rolled her eyes. "I'll show you those movies sometime. Have you been?" They spent a few hours catching up, sword fighting, and exploring the forests. Hazel stuck to the positive details of her life. Of course she trusted Piper, but she and Nico shared a unique connection. Nobody else knew what it was like to be treated like a literal undead zombie every now and then. Nobody else had been displaced in time. Even at times when they didn't get a chance to talk, simply seeing him was a relief. Besides, she was starting to worry. As normal as it was for him to avoid seeing other people like the plague, it wasn't healthy. Since he'd started dating Will, he'd gotten better at coming out of his shell, enough so that not seeing him all day probably meant something was wrong. By the time the daylight started to wane over the valley, she said goodbye to Piper and went looking for her brother. She saw Will by the Apollo cabin, dressed in some kind of mad scientist and mad doctor crossover outfit, with fake bloodstains, rusted tools, a torn jacket, and a mess of green in his undeniably blonde hair. If he'd tried to dye it, it hadn't worked. When she asked about Nico, his gaze drifted to the ground. I went to see him this morning, but he said he wanted to be alone. I didn't want to force it. I don't know if... He trailed off. It's fine, she said. He's in his cabin? Will shrugged. When Hazel knocked on Cabin 13's door, Nico's voice called out, Will, I told you it's not... It's me, she said. A moment later, the door opened. Nico was wearing his usual black jeans and tattered t-shirt. He greeted Hazel with a warm smile, but the joy didn't reach his eyes. It's really nice to see you, he said, letting her inside the cabin. It looked slightly different than usual. The bed was freshly made and everything was tidied up.
Like he'd gotten bored enough that he'd actually decided to organize the room.
Likewise, she said. Where have you been all day? He spread his arms awkwardly. Here. Hazel tilted her head at him. Usually when Nico needed some alone time, his go-to solution was to shadow travel into the woods or the underworld. The cabins were a little too close to the camp's usual commotion, even on a regular day, to feel peaceful or quiet. Besides, Nico had a tendency to wander when he wanted to be by himself. He seemed to pick up on her confusion.
I just didn't want to have to leave my cabin and talk to people. Besides, I'm saving my energy.
For what?
Tonight, he explained. Will asked me to use my powers to make the party more realistic or something.
Hazel nodded. After the campfire sing-alongs, everyone would be hanging out in the woods, eating and talking until late, which was probably the closest the Camp Half-Blood would ever get to a normal teen party. And you agreed? She remarked. Nico shrugged.
He really wanted me to do it. Kept talking about how cool it would be or whatever. I didn't want to let him down.
She frowned. You've been in your cabin all day. Are you sure you're up to being seen at a party?
Who said anything about being seen?
He asked flatly. Hazel rolled her eyes. Of course Nico would just sit outside the light of the fire watching the party happen, but it reminded her too much of the old him, the unhappy him. Nico, she put her hand on his wrist. Tell me what's going on.
He looked like he wanted to play dumb and try to worm his way out of the conversation, but her serious expression must have told him that she wasn't letting it go. You mean, aside from the fact that the dead are so disrespected that they become cheap decorations for the day?
Nico wrinkled his nose like the words left a bad taste in his mouth. Yeah, she agreed, sitting on his bed and patting the space next to her. Aside from that. Before Nico could respond, she added, the zombies you summon aren't like ghosts. They have no brains and couldn't much care how they spend their time. I know that's not the only reason you're hiding out in your cabin. I am not hiding out, Nico protested, sitting next to her. She raised an eyebrow at him. Well, he relented. Okay, I guess I am. He stayed quiet for a minute, then sighed. Maybe this sounds selfish, but I don't need this, you know? I don't need my powers to turn me into the life of the party just for everyone to forget about it tomorrow. Hazel tried to hide her surprise. The life of the party? Nico had never described himself that way before. Nico rested his chin on his knuckles and laughed without humor.
Hazel, I've been through this before. After the war with the Titans, everyone thought it was so cool how I brought Hades into the fight and summoned warriors to fight Cronus' army.
It was cool, she added. Nico shifted.
Thanks.
But, well, no one really thinks about that anymore. By the time a few weeks passed and the war wasn't in the forefront of their minds anymore, demigods here stopped wanting me around. Hazel took his hand. Nico. She wanted to tell him that wasn't true, like Will and their other friends would. But she figured it wasn't what he needed to hear. He shook his head. You don't need to hear about this, Hazel. I'm sorry. You can... He stood up to open the door, but Hazel crossed her arms. Nico, I came here because you needed to talk to someone. I don't want to be a burden, he said. You should get to enjoy the day. Hazel stood up and blocked his way. Nico di Angelo, she said. If there's something you need to get out in the open, you sit back down and talk to me. Nico stared at her in shock for a moment and hesitantly sat on his bed. Hazel followed suit.
Thanks, he said awkwardly.
like he wasn't sure how to react. After a few moments of silence, he started talking.
Will always says it was in my head, that no one pushed me away, but I knew I didn't fit in. I couldn't read their signs.
I was foolish. I thought just because all this stuff had happened in my life and I'd come so far, I could figure out... He made a vague gesture with his hands. People. He let out a painful breath. I couldn't. I never knew the right way to talk to them, enter the conversation, or whatever it was. All I did was scare people and make them uncomfortable. I never understood what I did wrong, but I didn't belong. That much was clear. He stared at his hands, then glanced at his sister.
There's no point in being the cool underworld kid who can summon skeletons and bring the party to the next level on Halloween,
he explained distastefully. Just to go back to being the creepy son of Hades that no one likes tomorrow. Hazel nodded understandingly. Trying to avoid attention? She asked. It's a classic move for the both of us. I did it when I first arrived at Camp Jupiter. As she spoke, a sudden series of memories bubbled into her mind. She looked him in the eyes. Nico, I know what you're feeling. Maybe not entirely, but... Well, did I ever tell you about the rumors? Nico raised an eyebrow. The ones Octavian spread about you? She shook her head. After we defeated the giants, I don't know how, but word got out about my mom. About who people thought she was. Who I was. How did they stop? They didn't, she said bluntly. Nico blinked. But how did I become Priador? She finished. I'm not sure, honestly. It wasn't easy, being Centurion and having people say all this stuff. I kept trying to avoid it, and all the feelings that came with it. I'd only speak during Senate meetings or when I had to. For a while, I kind of tried to just disappear. You sound like me, he remarked, his expression unreadable. Yeah, well, I couldn't stay that way forever, and it felt like things were just getting worse. I had responsibilities to the 5th cohort. So as cliche as it sounds, I just had to be myself. Focus on being the leader I had to be. And, well, the rumors weren't such a big deal anymore. Not just to me, but to everyone else. When I shut myself out, or tried to, the rumors became the only image people had of me. When I opened myself up to the other Legionnaires, they could see me for who I was. It didn't stop the gossip, but people started caring less about it. Especially the camp's new arrivals. Lavinia doesn't care about the rumors at all. She even defended me over them earlier today. I know it's harder than it sounds, but if you want to be more than a rumor, you have to show them who you really are. Nico looked at his feet. Or I could just be neither. Hide out until they forget I exist. Hazel nodded. You could, but that's not what you want, is it? He stared at her. His face was a mix of shame, discomfort, and a little bit of hope. People aren't meant to be alone, Nico. You're no exception. You need connection. And I think you want it, too. His eyes widened in shock, like they were saying, since when could you read minds? It must not be easy, she continued, after being alone for so long. But I think you know this is a risk you have to take. It's more than a risk. His voice started to shake. It was so humiliating to be that weird creep after the Titan War, to know that no one wanted me around, that it would be better if I just left. Nico, you have to let go of the past, she insisted. I have to protect myself, he countered. I can't just risk that happening again. This humiliation, this shame. I'm not letting myself be vulnerable like that again. He stared at his hands, holding back tears. I don't care if it makes me mean or cold. It's the only way. After being that weird kid no one wanted to talk to at boarding school with Bianca, and then the same thing at camp, it's not an option. He closed his eyes as his voice turned to a whisper. This fear, it's always going to be here. Believe me, I wish I could get past it, but I just know I won't. It's completely overwhelming. It paralyzes me, and I just hold in on myself. Hazel put her arm around Nico's shoulder as he cried. She thought she heard him whimpering, but it was hard to tell. The crying only lasted a few minutes, like his fear was too intense to keep in the forefront of his mind for longer than that. She could almost feel his vulnerability being replaced with discomfort. Like in that moment, he wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to hide here all night. "It's not going to help you," she said, and she knew he understood what she meant. "Nico, why did you really agree to raise zombies tonight? It wasn't just for Will, was it?" He bit his lip. "I think you know." "I want to hear you say it," she said, gently but firmly. Nico ran his hand through his hair. Maybe a small part of me thought it would be a start, or just a small way to... Hazel grinned, like, "Come on, spit it out." "Talk to people," he said with an awkward smile. "There it is," she said with a sigh of relief. She glanced outside. The sun was almost set, and she guessed it would be time for dinner any minute now. Hazel knew that friendships took time, but sharing a meal could be a start. "You know," Nico said, smiling for the first time all day, "they have a mist machine set up for the party tonight. You can still control the mist, can't you?" Hazel scoffed. "Wrong type of mist. You can still control it," he pointed out. Hazel pondered this for a moment. "As long as you don't disappear into the shadows," she decided, holding out her hand. "Deal." Nico shook it. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this fanfiction. This was my first crack at writing fanfiction, so I hope it went well. Let me know your opinions down below, and I'll see you all next Friday. Bye! Okay, I'm sorry if you can hear someone mowing their lawn in the loudest possible way in the background, and my mom screaming on the phone. Like, lady, the phone is right next to your face. You don't have to yell. I don't know if you guys can hear it. The lawnmower keeps going like...